In the bitter cold of Chicago, an ambulance rushes through the empty streets carrying Claire Lawson, a 35-year-old woman in labor, in pain that seems to tear her body apart. Her second child with her husband, Mark, is in danger, only a short distance from the hospital. But just as hope is near, a police car suddenly blocks the road, its flashing lights shining directly into their eyes, creating extreme tension. Mark and Claire are impatient, but the police officer standing in the way has a cold, unyielding expression. Their lives are threatened by an unexpected decision. What will happen when the lives of his wife and child are in the hands of an unsympathetic police officer? The truth will be revealed, but will time be enough to save them? Follow this tense and emotional story. Chicago in the afternoon, the cold air did not seem to ease the anxiety that hung over the ambulance. A light rain fell on the windows, the city lights reflecting in the drops, creating a gloomy picture. There was no comfort for the people inside this car. Claire Lawson, a 35-year-old woman, was in labor, breathing heavily. Each pain came like a wave, pulling her into the darkness. She braced herself, trying to breathe evenly, but the pain did not let go. Her hands tightly clasped her husband's hand, Mark Lawson, a strong man who could not hide the worry in his eyes. They both knew that the hospital was just a short distance away, but every second and minute passed like a century for them. Mark looked at his wife, trying to smile to reassure her, but Claire could only respond with a painful frown. "Are you okay?" Mark asked, his voice trembling, though he tried to hide the panic in his heart. Claire could only nod weakly. "Just a little more. I'll be fine." She held his hand tightly again as the pain continued to attack. Beads of sweat formed on her forehead, each passing second making Claire feel like she was sinking deeper into an abyss with no way out. The scene outside the ambulance was blurred by the flashing lights of the police cars. Mark looked out the window, feeling the tension growing. Claire, his wife, was still suffering from severe labor pains. Each wave of pain crashed through her body like a giant wave, impossible to resist. She held his hand tightly, trying to breathe through the pain. "We're almost there, Claire. Just a little more." Mark tried to comfort her, though he couldn't hide the anxiety in his eyes. Sweat was dripping down her face, and each wave of pain seemed to tear her body apart. Alex Morgan, the paramedic, couldn't help but feel the tension overwhelming him. Every second mattered. He knew that. Claire and the baby in her womb were in danger. He glanced in the rearview mirror, noticing a police car blocking the way. The red lights from the car were blinding, illuminating the ambulance and creating an immediate sense of tension. "We can't stop. He's blocking us." Mark shouted, unable to contain his anger. Alex looked through the window. Officer Raymond Grant was standing in front of the ambulance, his hands at his sides, his face devoid of sympathy. Alex rolled down the window, trying to keep his voice calm, but unable to hide the worry in his tone. "We're in an emergency, officer. We need to get to the hospital immediately. She's in labor. The baby could be in danger." Officer Grant looked straight at Alex, his eyes as cold as ice. "I saw you run a red light and speed. I need your papers immediately. Rules are rules, no exceptions." Alex gripped the steering wheel, trying to contain his rising frustration. "We don't have time for papers. This woman is in labor. The baby is in danger. There is no time to wait." Grant was unyielding. "No papers. No way. You have to stop." Mark, unable to bear it any longer, shouted from the back seat. "Do you know that this is the life of my wife and child?" "What the hell are you doing?" "Shut up!" Officer Grant roared. "I am on duty and you have to obey the law." The tension was so intense that it was hard to breathe. Alex felt his body tense like a bowstring, every second a struggle between life and death. He turned to Mark, his eyes filled with helplessness. "Mark, calm down. We have to let me handle this," he said in a firm voice. Mark looked into Alex's eyes, then back at Officer Grant. He saw his helplessness in every look, every movement. But Mark could not bear it any longer. "Please," he whispered. "She won't last." Then Officer Grant suddenly acted. Without warning, he rushed forward, grabbed the handle of the car door, and threw it open. Before Alex could react, Officer Grant swung his arm and hit him hard in the face. The punch was as powerful as a lightning bolt, hitting Alex's chin, sending him flying backward and crashing into the equipment cabinets in the car. There was a loud crash, the air around him seemed to compress, and blood began to ooze from Alex's mouth. Alex felt dizzy. He was in pain from the punch, but still tried to get up. His mouth was full of blood, but he couldn't let this situation go any further. The dizziness had not yet passed, but he immediately looked up, meeting Officer Grant's hostile eyes. Mark, furious, stood up and rushed toward Officer Grant, but Alex quickly held him back, not letting him advance. "Don't do that, Mark," Alex shouted, his voice full of fatigue. "You can't do that. We have to stay calm." Officer Grant ignored their protests. "If you don't follow my orders, I'll report you for obstruction," he shouted, standing firm as a rock, his hand still gripping the ambulance door. Alex, still reeling from the shock, managed to stand firm and spoke in a resolute voice. "You can't stop us. She needs to get to the hospital. You're being stupid." Mark could see the situation getting worse, but he had to hold back. He felt despair creeping into his mind. "We can't stop," Mark whispered, holding Claire's hand, unable to do anything but pray. How this tense, dramatic situation would continue, no one knew, but Claire, in pain, had no strength left to continue fighting. All hope seemed to be pinned on a fragile hope. Officer Grant stood there, his cold gaze never leaving Alex, as if he wanted to compress all the tension into him. Alex clenched his fists, the pain from the punch still lingering, but he knew he couldn't stop. Every second, every minute could mean the life of Claire and her unborn child. Mark, still angry and unable to control himself, glanced at Claire through the rearview mirror. She was panting, sweat dripping down her face, her hands gripping his. He could feel the pain tearing through her body, and he was even more afraid that she wouldn't be able to hold on much longer. "We can't stop," Mark roared. "He'll kill us. We have to go." Alex looked at Mark, his eyes filled with pain but also with determination. He glanced at Officer Grant, who stood still, unyielding. The air seemed to freeze, a tense silence. Suddenly from behind, a car horn sounded. Another police car rushed over, then another. The flashing lights created a blinding wall of light, covering the ambulance and making the situation even more tense. Mark saw these police cars stop right behind Officer Grant's car, and a team of police officers stepped out. But what was remarkable was that this time, they were not ordinary police officers, but those who seemed to be higher up the ladder of power. A woman with long black hair, wearing an official uniform, stepped out of the first car. She stepped forward, her eyes sharp, the light from the car headlights illuminating her face, creating an image of power. "Grant!" Her voice rang out with authority. "Back off!" Officer Grant turned to look at her, then looked down at the ground. His eyes could not hide his annoyance, but he did not dare to refute. "Olivia, I'm just doing my job," he said, his voice firm but reserved. "Not now, Grant," Olivia Hayes, the support team leader, said coldly. "Can't you see we're in an emergency? You've caused a major delay. Stop." Officer Grant said nothing more, just pursed his lips and looked at his team leader. Olivia turned back to Alex and Mark, her eyes softening slightly. "Thank you for your patience," Olivia said, her voice calm but determined. "You can go now. Let me handle this." Mark looked at Claire, unable to speak, only sighing in relief. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice still filled with concern. Olivia turned back to Officer Grant, her eyes as sharp as knives. "Get out of here, Grant. You've overdone it." She didn't need to say more. Her gaze was enough to make Grant back away, but not without reluctance. Grant took a deep breath, his eyes still filled with anger, but he had no choice but to turn and walk toward his police car. "I can't stand this," he muttered, then climbed into the car and closed the door. Olivia stood watching, her eyes never leaving the police car as it drove away. She turned, nodding to Alex and Mark. "Go," she said, then turned back to the group of police officers on the scene. "Secure this area and make sure no one gets in your way." Alex said nothing, just nodded and started driving the ambulance toward the hospital. He breathed a sigh of relief when the police car finally pulled out of the driveway. Mark looked into his wife's eyes, feeling a little hope return, even though the tension still filled the air. "We're almost there, Claire," Mark said, but his voice sounded weak, as if he was just a moment away from collapsing. "Hang on, honey." Claire, meanwhile, couldn't answer, only nodded slightly, but her eyes were tired and terrified. She knew things were spiraling out of control, but she didn't have the strength to fight anymore. The only thing she could do was try to get to the hospital as quickly as possible. When the ambulance finally stopped in front of the hospital, Mark couldn't help but breathe a sigh of relief. Stepping out of the vehicle, he hurriedly ran to the back door where Claire was lying on the stretcher. His mind was spinning. He had no sense of time, no sense of space. There was only his wife and the baby in danger. The hospital rushed to receive her. The nurses and doctors quickly pulled Claire into the emergency room, and immediately, a team of doctors was ready to perform emergency surgery. Mark could do nothing but stand still in the hallway, his eyes wide open, glued to the closed door of the operating room. He was filled with helplessness, feeling as if he was being suffocated by fear. He turned around, his hands gripping the railing tightly, feeling as if he wouldn't be able to bear it any longer. What should he do now? The voice of Paul, his father-in-law, rang out behind him. Paul walked up to Mark, his eyes filled with worry, unable to hide his confusion. "Thank you, Father, for coming." Mark looked up, feeling like he had just found a solid support in this moment. He felt the pain from the cramps in his heart, the anxiety growing. Paul patted Mark's shoulder, but the silence in the air was unavoidable. "Claire will be fine," he said, trying to comfort but unable to hide his own tension. Every minute that passed was a challenge for Mark. Suddenly, the light from the surgical lights behind the emergency room door flickered on. His heart pounded, as if time had stopped. It can't be. If it weren't for that delay, Claire might not have had complications. Mark whispered, his eyes fixed on the door, his hands gripping the railing. Paul looked at his son-in-law, unable to help but understand the pain in his eyes. "Don't blame yourself," Paul said softly. "No one can predict anything. But I will help you clear things up about that officer." Mark looked at Paul, his eyes determined. "If it weren't for the police stopping us, we could have gotten to the hospital in time. Claire wouldn't have had these complications." Paul nodded, saying nothing more, but his eyes said it all. He understood that this couldn't just end with an apology. Officer Grant would pay for what he had done, not only for his actions towards Mark's family, but also for the dangers he had put other innocent lives at risk. Suddenly, the door to the emergency room opened, and a doctor in a white coat stepped out, his forehead furrowed, his eyes tense. "How is it, doctor?" Mark asked hurriedly, unable to keep the worry out of his voice. "The surgery was a success," the doctor replied, but his expression still wasn't completely calm. "Both mother and child are stable, but the mother's condition is a bit complicated. She lost a lot of blood, and the baby was in danger because of the delay in getting to the hospital." Mark felt a wave of relief wash over him, but at the same time, anger flared up in his heart. If it weren't for that officer's unreasonable intervention, we would have arrived in time. All we needed was to get here quickly. Mark couldn't hold back anymore. He shouted, his eyes red. The doctor looked at Mark, then at Paul, knowing that this was the time to clarify things. "I understand," the doctor said, his voice serious. "We're doing our best to save her. Now all that's left is to recover her, but it will take time." Mark nodded, but his anger was still there. "We won't let this go quietly. Officer Grant will pay," Mark said, determination in his voice. Paul put his hand on his son-in-law's shoulder, his eyes full of support. "I will help you clear things up. They cannot be allowed to get away with this." Mark stood silently by the window of the hospital room, looking out but seeing nothing but the darkness of a rainy night. The tension inside him did not let up. Claire was resting in her room, but he could not rest. He could not just sit still and wait. Officer Grant, the policeman who had stopped the ambulance, was still out there, and what he had done to their family would be paid for. "We can't let this go," Mark whispered, turning to look at Paul, who was sitting by Claire's bed. Paul looked at his son-in-law, his eyes filled with determination. "You're right, Mark. We will not let what happened go." Mark turned to look at Claire. She was lying still on the bed, her lips slightly parted as if she were in a dreamy sleep. But he knew that sleep was not peaceful. It was just a temporary moment after the storm she had been through. Both she and the baby were out of danger, but the consequences of the delay were still lingering. "She'll be fine soon, but Claire will need time to recover. Don't let this go, Mark. Do something," Paul continued. Mark sighed and walked out of the hospital room. He was determined not to let Officer Grant get away with what he had done. He took his phone from his pocket and dialed one of the lawyers he knew who had helped him in the past. "Hello, this is Mark Lawson. I need to see you right away. It's important." he said when the other end answered. An hour later, Mark and Paul were sitting in the small office of a prominent Chicago attorney. The lawyer, Jack Turner, a middle-aged man with a sharp gaze, had listened intently to their story. "This is a serious matter," Jack said, waving them to sit down. "The police obstructed the emergency response, and Officer Grant's actions were clearly unacceptable." "What should we do now?" Mark asked, his voice filled with determination. Jack picked up the phone on the table and called one of his colleagues. "We'll start by gathering all the evidence available, especially video footage from witnesses. They must be the ones who are important in proving Officer Grant's wrongdoing," Jack said, his eyes shining with determination. "We're not going to let this fall into obscurity." Mark nodded. "I need to get this straight. Claire and we can't sit idly by while her life is in danger because of a police officer's stupidity." Meanwhile, videos of the incident from witnesses began to circulate on social media. Cell phone footage showed Officer Grant not only blocking the ambulance, but also being rude and violent as he punched Alex. The press and media quickly began to take notice, and the public pressure only made the case more serious for Officer Grant. Paul and Mark continued to gather the necessary evidence, including videos from people at the scene and recordings from calls to the police. Jack began working with other lawyers to file a lawsuit against Officer Grant for obstructing emergency medical care, assaulting paramedics, and endangering the lives of both Claire and the baby. The next day, Mark and Jack went to the police station to request information and clarify everything. When they arrived, Mark felt a surge of anger when he saw Officer Grant still standing there, as if nothing had happened. Jack took Mark to see the judge, and they prepared to file a formal lawsuit. Things escalated when eyewitness videos came out. Officer Grant faced criticism from the community, and from there, the public's attention was focused on his wrongdoing. "We will not stand for anyone who violates another person's right to life," Jack declared as Mark saw the light of justice beginning to appear. "Justice will be served." A week after the lawsuit was filed, Mark sat in the courtroom, feeling nervous and tense. Everything seemed to be going his way, but he couldn't help but feel anxious about the outcome. Facing justice wasn't easy, but he knew he couldn't back down. Sitting with him was Jack, their attorney. Jack, who had been with the case from the beginning, sat solemnly, his sharp gaze never leaving the documents on the table. "Today is an important day," Jack said, his voice low and steady. "We have to prepare for what's coming. The evidence is there, and public opinion is on our side." Mark nodded, but he couldn't shake the worry in his heart. What if Officer Grant gets released? What if everything we do isn't enough to hold him accountable? Jack smiled softly, a comforting smile. "We've prepared thoroughly. The evidence is strong, and the public is putting a lot of pressure. There's no way he can escape this time." Mark could only hope for Jack's words. He looked at the door of the courtroom, his eyes filled with determination, but also with uncertainty. Time seemed to pass more slowly than ever. When they entered the courtroom, all eyes were on them. The scene before them was solemn. In front of Mark was Officer Grant, who still maintained a cold and indifferent expression. He sat there, showing no sign of remorse, even though his actions had caused a lot of pain to Mark's family. The judge entered the room, and everyone stood up to salute. After the judge asked everyone to sit down, the trial officially began. "Your Honor," Jack began, his voice serious and determined, "today we will prove that Officer Grant's actions are unforgivable. He obstructed the rescue, endangered the life of a woman in labor, and assaulted an ambulance worker, all because he wanted to exert power. We will present clear evidence to prove that he abused his power." Jack began to present video footage from witnesses, recorded calls, and other evidence his team had collected. The videos clearly showed Officer Grant blocking the ambulance and then acting rudely, hitting Alex for no good reason. The public was rooting for Mark's family, and each video brought the room to a standstill. "We have enough evidence to confirm that Officer Grant's actions were illegal and endangered the lives of others," Jack continued. Mark looked at Officer Grant, anger and determination growing inside him. He thought about Claire, about the baby, about what they had gone through because of a police officer abusing his power. As the trial continued, Officer Grant's defense attorney began to make his case. He asserted that Officer Grant was simply performing his duties and that his actions were for the sake of public safety. He tried to come up with a rationale for stopping the ambulance and even for the violence. But Jack, with his calm and sharp demeanor, quickly dismissed all of the opposing attorney's arguments. There is no excuse for this violence. Officer Grant crossed the line, and we have enough evidence to prove it. Finally, the judge began to deliberate and make his decision. After a while, all eyes were on the judge as he rose to announce the verdict. After reviewing all the evidence and hearing the arguments from both sides, I find that Officer Raymond Grant violated the rights of a citizen, endangered the life of the victim, and assaulted an emergency worker while he was performing his official duties. Officer Grant will be convicted of assault, obstruction of emergency care, and abuse of power. The courtroom was silent for a second, then erupted into applause. Mark felt a great sense of relief wash over him. Claire would be declared the victor in this battle, and Officer Grant would finally pay for his actions. After the trial, Mark and Paul stood at the door of the courtroom, feeling as if a weight had been lifted from their hearts. Jack smiled at them, his eyes filled with pride. "We did it. This is a great victory not only for your families, but for all those who have been abused." Mark looked into Paul's eyes, then toward the hospital doors where Claire was resting. "Thank you for always being there for me," Mark said, his voice breaking. "With this justice, we can start over. Thank you all." "It's okay, son," Paul replied, his eyes softening, filled with satisfaction. "We fought for what was right, and justice has been served."